welcome to this panel discussion on cloud security in digital transformation of the electronic manufacturing services. I'm joined by Chintan Sutaria, who is the founder and CEO of CalcuQuote, and Matt Konda, who is also the founder and CEO, I assume, of securityprogram.io. First of all, guys, what I wanted to talk a little bit about was the importance of this topic. It feels like cloud security has been an issue that we've discussed a lot in the industry, but we haven't really closed out on, and it seems to have slowed the deployment of Industry 4.0, smart factory, digital transformation. Chintan, you talk to a lot of EMS guys. Is that something you're hearing from them? Is there a nervousness to putting stuff in the cloud that's actually slowing down their deployment and the opportunity to reap the benefits of that transformation?
Yeah, I think from an EMS company's perspective, whenever we're talking to them, they're very nervous because they're not only responsible for their own data, but the data of their customers, right? They're building things that are the intellectual property of the people who have spent a lot of energy into creating this electronic designs and things like that. So there is definitely a lot of nervousness about how am I going to make sure that I protect this, because my business depends on me not violating that trust with my customer. And that's kind of what brings up this conversation usually. The second thing is because I think just EMS companies are so used to the physical control that they have over their products, the idea of not physically having control over their servers is a little bit nerve-wracking to them, right? It's somewhere in the cloud, it's not right in front of me. I can't control what I can't hold in my hands. And so that's definitely something that a lot of EMS companies think about is, well, how can I rely on something if I can't, pick it up and carry it home with me?
Yeah. And Matt, we've got that experience from the electronic manufacturing industry and manufacturing and supply chain generally. Is that something that's typical across other industries, or there are other industries that are, way more progressive and way happier to commit their data to the cloud?
Well, I think every industry has had an adoption curve, and some may have been faster than others. Certainly 10 years ago, banks were hesitant to move processing to the cloud. And I think one of the things that's changed a lot is that the cloud infrastructure has matured a lot to support those kinds of advanced use cases. So if you look at what the cloud provides from a security perspective now, it would be very costly to assemble yourself. And there are other challenges, which I think we'll talk about in a minute, in terms of complexity and so forth, of actually succeeding with implementation in the cloud. But I don't necessarily think that, I don't see industries that are not moving to the cloud other than perhaps the most secret government operations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Chintan, when we look at this opportunity to have stuff in the cloud, it brings us to a kind of a fundamental question of whether we deploy stuff in the cloud and we are able to manage it remotely, or if we rely on site. There's a compromise to what can be done with that. How do you see that discussion, and what do you see the impact that has, particularly with your customers? If you had to do stuff on site compared to remotely, how would it impact on what you can actually achieve?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of, you asked about how CalcuQuote deals with this with our customers, and a lot of what drove the early decisions about CalcuQuote and how we would be hosted versus being on-premise deployments was my experience in EMS, right? When I was working in EMS, we had, it was a decent sized company, but we really had still very limited IT resources, very limited capabilities in terms of, how we were going to maintain our infrastructure and how resilient it would be, and how much it would be backed up and things like that. And that's true for any company, right? Any small business out there does not have the same capabilities as Amazon and Microsoft in terms of maintaining resiliency. The other thing that really drove our decision early on was when we did have on-premise deployment of software when I was in EMS, a lot of times if there was any kind of issues or things like that, it was, well, whose fault is it? right? Is it your local server? Is it the service provider? Is it the software provider? So when you get into debugging, it was always a challenge because you'd have to either grant them remote access, which was a little bit nerve-wracking because there's other things, right? Or you'd have to take a backup and send it to them, and they'd have to evaluate it and send it back to you. And now you're transferring large amounts of data across the internet anyway, which is the thing you didn't want to do. And then the third thing I think was about the pace of innovation, right? So if we had on-premise deployment, what was happening was anytime there was an update, it was like a whole thing, right? Because the software service provider would say, hey, we have an update coming out. And then you'd have to say, okay, IT resources, we need to allocate a window where you're going to do this outside of production hours. And you couldn't just say like, hey, here's a new thing, we're going to deploy it. Whereas with the decisions we made with CalcuQuote early on is because everything is cloud-based, it's like there's only one place you go for everything. And that thing knows everything about your environment, right? So now when we have customers coming to us with new ideas, we can constantly deploy new features and functionality. We can constantly help them in their environment because we know what their environment is. The only thing that might be different from customer to customer is the browser they're using.
Yeah. Yeah, and Matt, when you look at that from a business point of view, and Chintan as well, I am interested in your opinion on this. Does it impact the business model? Because when we look at as a service models, particularly SaaS models, they're generally cloud-based. Companies that are providing maybe more of a consultative software approach and deploying complex, large software systems that need lots of customization and lots of maintenance, and maybe more the on-site system. Does the ability to do it in the cloud make better business models available for people? Matt, maybe you want to take that first.
Sure. So from a business perspective, I think the answer is yes. And one of the key things is the ability to do integrations. And an important security integration that we see is with identity providers, for instance. We can standardize how we handle who someone is without having to, perform a high degree of customization. Building off of something that Chintan said, though, I think of being able to update software as a very significant security feature, right? So if I think about security, one of the things that happens is the world changes. Something new comes out. If I can't update my system, I could have a security vulnerability sitting for, a decade on a Windows XP system, right? Which I can't update because maybe the right people aren't in the room at the same time to do the update. Whereas if you're in a cloud-based system or in a SaaS-based system where, a provider like CalcuQuote or securityprogram.io can update the software to address that security vulnerability for all of the customers. We test once, we implement once, we have clear operational controls around how it happens, but it's not ad hoc or different across all these different places. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Chintan might have better insight into the business side of that question, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chintan, where do you see it in terms of actually allowing you to have a business model that's not just good for you, but also very good for your customers?
Yeah, and I think the biggest contrast in a SaaS-based model versus like an on-premise traditional deployment licensing model, I think to me is if you contrast to ERP systems, right? Traditional ERP systems where they do an on-site deployment and you have your own server and things like that. I think it was back in 2016, maybe 2017, where I was talking to the owner of a small ERP company, and one of the things that he said was challenging is, well, I've sold a bunch of licenses to this industry and we have good market penetration, but now it's really hard for me to find new customers. So I can't afford to update my software, right? Like I've already sold all the licenses. So you're constantly trying to manage updates, but you don't have any new customers that are coming in and paying you. So how are you going to do that? Well, now you got to go back and sell maintenance agreements, which is effectively a similar type of business model, right? You're relying on that recurring income. except that you've already sold the majority of the licenses. So you've already committed a lot of money from the customers to you. Whereas in a SaaS-based model, what I like about it is it affords the opportunity for us to continue to maintain a development team, continue to invest in upgrades, because it's not only, especially in an environment like CalcuQuote, where it's not only that we're offering new features, it's kind of what Matt said, the world around us is changing, right? And so CalcuQuote's changing, the world around us is changing, DigiKey's updating their API, Arrow's updating their API, Avnet's updating their API. We have to maintain all of those things, and it makes a lot more sense for us to live in that world if we can continue to be a partner for our customers.
Yeah, and I think that SaaS thing is all about partnership, and it's all about constantly delivering value and constantly measuring value, and you've got that cycle of renewal that keeps everything fresh and everything moving. So you get to the point where go ahead.
One more thing I was going to add to that is when we talk about customers adopting CalcuQuote, it also helps to be able to say, look, there isn't a huge upfront investment you have to make, right? Even with CalcuQuotes, we don't do long-term contracts. We don't force you to stay with us. That's, you decide this month, and then we have to win your business back every month after that. And so the proof is in the pudding now. If you continue to keep customers and they keep coming back to you every month, you're continuously delivering value. And so it's an easy decision for the customer, and it is a continuous feedback loop for us and our product team.
Yeah,
exactly. I was just going to add, I've done projects where if you're implementing an on-premise software solution, there could be a week or a month of integration time to get everything set up and working, where with our SaaS solution, essentially you turn it on and you have the core parts of the system working right away. And if you want to turn it off, you can turn it off. Right. And if you want to turn it back on later, you can turn it back on later, right? It's very flexible. And that's a nice benefit for many of our customers.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it from a value management point of view, those SaaS models, those recurring models where you're spending X per month and you're getting Y in value, and hopefully Y is 3 or 4 times X, then you know exactly what's going on, and you can constantly see that, and you can constantly measure that. And if Chintan's constantly bringing out new levels, new developments, new ideas to actually increase that value, then people are even happier. So Chintan, you get to the point where you decide, okay, cloud is the way to go, but security is hugely important to you, and you've got to look after your data, you've got to look after your customers' data, and you've got to look after the data of all those people whose APIs you're operating as well. Talk me through a little bit the process of securing that data and working with securityprogram.ai, and then what AIO, and then we'll come to Matt and hear about some of the methodology from his side.
Yeah, so I'll say security in CalcuQuote, I mean, from the beginning, there was definitely a mindset about, okay, if we fail to secure our customers' data, we also don't have a business, right? All it takes is one major breach where customers say, clearly, you haven't been paying attention to what we've been telling you. So it started from the beginning that way. The other thing is, I think it was a strategic, because of that realization, it was a strategic imperative for us, right? If we didn't focus on security, we didn't have a long future in this industry. I think it was maybe back in 2017, we engaged Matt and his company to start advising us on security, because the reality of security is, because the threats are constantly changing, it really requires somebody who is an expert in that, right? It helped initially just for us to get our feet wet in it, to just say, okay, what are all the different considerations of security? How are we going to stay on top of this? What policies, procedures, things like that do we need to have internally? Since then, we also started to use securityprogram.io also to help manage some of those things, right? So if anybody's ever gone through like an ISO 9001 implementation, which I know a lot of EMS companies do go through, right? It's awful because of the paperwork and because of all the things that you have to check the box on and all of the trainings you have to do and all of those things. And having a systematic way for us to manage all of that, which is what we got through securityprogram.io, really helped. And that's what we use it for is, we do continuous training internally for our for all of our team members, right? So anybody that's going to have access to sensitive information, they're accessing training videos. We also have an internal chat channel where, you know, we're constantly staying on top of things like, for example, more often than not, we actually get most of our threats from our actual customers because their email gets breached and they start sending out phishing emails to their contacts. And so we actually have a channel internally where we're saying, hey, watch out for this customer. It seems like something fishy is going on, right? And
Yeah.
no pun intended, but that's the kind of stuff that we try to protect against. And then the final thing is we also train on, you know, just social hacking, I think is the term for it, but making sure that, you know, our support people and people who are answering questions and just trying to be helpful people to our customers are also aware of proper security protocols and making sure we're identifying who we're talking to and things like that in the appropriate way.
Yeah, and Matt, when I look at what CalcuQuote do, it's connecting a whole lot of you know, a whole lot of customers at the top, a whole lot of suppliers here, you know, and they're in the middle, and there's all this data coming through them. It makes them, you know, absolutely fundamentally important in terms of having that security. How do you go about securing that environment that's connected to so many different places? And talk me through a little bit about the process of where you've been able to support CalcuQuote.
That's a great question. And as much as many executives want there to be a push a button, get a green checkbox solution, there really isn't. And so with securityprogram.io, we took sort of our philosophy and built it into a system. And what we did is we started with standards, which broadly cover the things that you need to think about. Are they perfect? No, they're not perfect. But they cover the breadth of what you're expected to do. And so what the system does is help you meet those standards. And those include things that are training for people, including what Chintan just referred to as far as social engineering and training people to be empowered to say no about transferring money to a third party without getting a confirmation, for instance, right? That's not a technical problem. The cloud or not cloud won't help you with that, right? That's just a challenge related to giving people both information and power to say, no, I need to check with my boss to confirm that. But also processes. So technology will help us with some parts of the challenge, but process is very important as well. How do I know that if somebody leaves my firm, I've deactivated all of their accounts, for instance, right? That is related to technology, but it's not a technology problem, really. It's a process problem. And there are innumerable examples just like that. And so the system also helps you by providing templates and proposed processes, which of course you need to adapt and make your own, right? Process won't work unless you actually make it your own. The idea being that now you have an understanding of how to do a particular thing related to security. And then of course there's the technology aspect, which is important, and in particular with the cloud is a big opportunity. Because the thing about the cloud that many people don't always initially realize is that we can automate lots of things against the cloud. The difference between my data center and any of the major cloud players is that I can control what exists in the cloud environment programmatically, and I can inspect it programmatically. I can't check your firewall on your on-premise system internally with a code, with a script or a chunk of code. But I can check your firewalls, both internal and external, in a cloud environment. I can check whether you have encryption enabled. I can check all kinds of things about how you have your cloud environment set up. And that's where the technology really enables us to do more for customers that care about this level of technical security. But I think the important thing to take away about securityprogram.io, and it's philosophical. It's not just for our system, but I think of it as sort of a philosophical truism in security, is that it takes those different pieces, no matter how you're solving the problem, it takes those different pieces to succeed.
Yeah, so you've got to bring it all together, and as Chintan says, you've got to be constantly developing. You know, it's got to be beholden on you, Matt, to advise Chintan when there's a new security challenge coming up, and make sure you're ready for it. I wanted to wrap up just with some key tips and takeaways from both points of view. So Chintan, from your side, from a point of view of deploying this, what are your kind of key tips and takeaways, and what resources would you point people towards if they're looking to deploy a cloud-based solution for anything within their business?
I think I think it starts with if they're looking to deploy to the cloud internally, let's say they've got their on-premise servers that they want to move to the cloud. I'd say if you're not experienced at it, it definitely helps initially, at least, to employ an expert to help you with that process, right? Because there is a lot of things that cloud takes off of your hands, but there's a lot of things where if you're not aware of how to do it properly, then you can mess it up, right? So that's one thing that I always encourage people to do. But the second thing I think is to get people to think about the business requirements, the process, the training, things like that, because the technology is, I think, with the likes of Microsoft and Amazon and Google doing some of the things they're doing in terms of cloud infrastructure as a service type stuff, they've made a lot of that stuff easy, but none of that matters if you're just writing a password on a Post-it note and taping it to your monitor, right? So that's the kind of stuff that if you're planning to go to the cloud, first take care of your house and then do those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think the idea of having that strategy very closely aligned with your business strategy is fundamentally important. I think when you go to someone like Matt, you've got to know exactly what you want to do with the cloud to enable that process. I think one of my takeaways would be to hire someone like Matt, because I'd want someone looking after it full time. It's not something that you can think, okay, I've got an hour a week, I'm going to spend that on security. It's a big task. Matt, where would you point people in terms of resources, and what advice would you give to someone that was maybe starting out on this process and has got an on-site and maybe multiple factories around the world and wants to go to a more remote cloud-based deployment?
Well, we tell people, and this is maybe counterintuitive, we tell people not to lift and shift, meaning don't take your existing system, pick it up and move it to a cloud environment. Make sure that you think about what cloud services you're using as you do that. Because, for instance, if you're in, and maybe I'll use AWS as a specific example, if I have an existing system in my own environment and I move it to AWS, I can use encryption on file systems with S3. I can use encryption with databases with RDS. I can use KMS to rotate the keys that are used and protect those keys. I can use a firewall. I can use all kinds of technology that is easily provided by the cloud platform, but may not fit into the architecture diagram I have for my existing solution. So that's one thing, is sort of don't lift and shift is the way we say that. The other is leverage automation. So, and this is another thing that I think aligns to what Chintan said about consulting with experts and making sure that you're kind of doing it in a solid way. But to the extent that you can automate and use what we call infrastructure as code, where you're defining your environment through code, now we can control the way that our environment looks the same way we control the running system. And that's a very powerful thing. And we can review that code, and we can even write analyzers for that code so that we can control the environment overall. I think I might just quickly add like 3 of the most common problems that people have, because that might be something people care about, right? Yeah. So we often see sensitive data exposed in public S3 buckets, for instance, or file systems. Every cloud provider has the same idea, where we just haven't done a good job making sure that the data is protected. Another thing we see are services that are exposed that shouldn't be. So something like Mongo or Elasticsearch or some back-end service is public where it shouldn't be. And then the third thing would be access controls or identity is not something that's reviewed carefully. So for instance, maybe I have a power user that's used everywhere. And just as a wild example, we've seen a company that deployed their root access keys in a mobile application that got deployed to an app store, meaning I could go decompile their mobile application and look for root access keys, right? So understanding how you control those tokens and who has access to what is an important thing to think about.
On the identity management part of it, kind of a funny story going back to just maintaining processes and stuff. We had a customer who called us one day and he goes, "Hey, I'm having trouble accessing. Can you give me my password?" Right, which is a common question we get, and we don't have your password. We can't give it to you. You have to do forgot password and restore it yourself. And then he goes, "Oh, well, my account seems to be, I seem to have locked myself out." And we're looking at this saying, "You haven't locked yourself out. What's going on?" Turns out that his previous employer had actually not shut off his access, but his new employer did in fact accidentally lock his account. And so we didn't know he had changed jobs, and we're trying to figure this out, right? But going back to maintaining proper identities and things like that, when an employee leaves, you want to control those for those kinds of things. And that's, it's a common type of mistake that in EMS you don't really think about all the time. You might take their badge away from entering the building, but there's other ways for them to enter the building.
Yeah, and when we look at it at the moment, those other ways of entering the building are the key ways. This is being recorded to the cloud. When we've edited it, it will be deployed to the cloud. Everything lives on the cloud right now. It's the only place I get to visit. It's the only, I'm pretty convinced I'm going to holiday in the cloud this year. That's kind of the only choice we've got. But one of my takeaways is yes, you've got to find a really good partner, but you've got to be really open, and they've got to really understand your business, just as you've got to understand what Matt can provide you in terms of services. Matt totally has to understand what your business model is, Chintan, for him to be able to do a good job and make sure he's got everything bulletproof for you, and that's hugely valuable.
It's like having a good lawyer.
Yeah,
you got to tell him everything.
And you've got to open the kimono, as they say. That guy's got to be on tap the whole time and available to you. Guys, thanks for the discussion. I think it's really valuable, and I think people will get some really good information from this. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope we can talk again soon. Thank you.